a friend of mine just returned from Mexico who's also spent time in Ukraine. And he said, this is going to sound terrible, but he said, I think Ukraine is more corrupt than Mexico. And of course, Mexico is effectively an organized crime state. So that's pretty bad. I think that's one dimension of the Ukraine problem right now. The other is, of course, the simple mass deaths that have occurred on the battlefield. You can look at this on satellite and you can see thousands of dead Ukrainian soldiers lying on the field that aren't recovered. You have Ukrainian units, platoon company size, maybe larger, I don't know, but certainly platoon and company size that made the decision to surrender to the Russians. They're fed up with the way they've been mismanaged, fed up with the abuse that they've taken from Kyiv. They've died in great numbers. They don't see any point in it. They're being asked to sacrifice themselves repeatedly for no tangible gain. And the worst part is that they can't even successfully evacuate. Many of them are severely wounded. So in many cases, Ukrainian commanders have contacted Russian commanders and said, I've got wounded here. I can't evacuate them. So I'm going to surrender because I want them to live. The Russians have always treated the surrendering Ukrainians well, and the Ukrainians know that. So as a result, I think you're going to see more and more surrenders. I think you're going to see more and more desertions. And at some point, the military is going to completely fragment and collapse. I don't know precisely when that will occur, but I don't think it's far off. Any military establishment, regardless of how brave, courageous, and disciplined the soldiers may be, after enough time under fire without result, without any tangible gain, begins to not just become demoralized, but question the rationale for the whole war. That happened to Russia in World War I. It happened to the Germans shortly before the end of the First World War. People finally say, enough, we can't go on. I think we're getting close to that in Ukraine. Even the foreign soldiers that have been fighting very hard on behalf of Ukraine are largely gone now. They've packed up and left. I think the Poles are the only ones left. And I'm told they're down to a few thousand. So I think we are now approaching what I consider to be the most dangerous point in the entire conflict. And the point I'm trying to make is Ukraine is on the verge of collapse. The Russians have not yet launched an all-out assault. Yes, they've launched an offensive in the northeastern portion of eastern Ukraine, and that is moving along well. And most of the Ukrainian forces are either being swept aside or melting away. That will continue, and I suspect that part of that will turn north to encircle Kharkov, and another part will continue towards Slovyansk and other territories behind Ukrainian lines. But the all-out assault that is waiting to happen has not yet been launched. And I think it will come when it becomes clear that we are not going to negotiate an end to this. On the contrary, I think there are people now considering seriously the use of NATO forces in Western Ukraine. And I think the Poles are leading this effort. It's why I talk about the Polish tail wagging the American dog. People in Washington are just effusive in their praise of the Poles. Oh, the Poles are wonderful. The Poles are great. They're the staunchest supporters of the war. We don't like those Germans. Those Germans don't like this war. Those Germans like Russians. They're bad. This kind of nonsense. I think we're in a lot of danger from Poland, from the Polish leadership and potentially the leadership in Lithuania, that they may actually send their forces into Western Ukraine. Remember that the so-called Ukrainian Galicia was part of Poland for many, many centuries. Of course, that is, you've got to go back to the 18th century before, until 1794 to show that. But after 1794, there was briefly between 1918 and 1939, a restoration of Polish control of some of that territory, as well as territory in Belarusia. And the Ukrainians know that, the Poles know it, the Lithuanians know it, and so do the Russians and Belarusians. And right now, Lukashenko is more than a little concerned about any attempt that the Poles and Lithuanians might make to regain control of, for instance, Minsk. You know, there used to be a giant monolith. I don't know if it's still there or not in Minsk. And when I say monolith, a stone tablet, if you will, that stood a couple of meters high at the entrance to Minsk on the east side of Minsk. And it said in 3 languages, I think Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian, "Here begins Lithuania." And there are lots of Lithuanians that regard these areas as theirs, just as the Poles regard much of Western Ukraine as theirs. In fact, the Poles controlled everything out to Kiev for a few hundred years. None of this has anything to do with NATO. And it's something that no one in Washington thoroughly understands or grasps. In fact, what people say in Washington, well, if that contributes to the ruin of Russia, well, then that's a good thing. Let the Poles go. They don't understand that if the Poles and Lithuanians do take a hand and go into Western Ukraine, that could regionalize the war, because they'll be up against not just Russia, but also Belarus. And the Russians then will no longer have much incentive to exercise restraint. And there's nothing in Western Europe, particularly in Poland or Germany, militarily, that the Russians cannot reach and destroy.
No, I think the Russians have seen this as a challenge, given that they now have Wagner's in Belarus and also sent nuclear weapons to Belarus. So I think they're trying to hedge against this prospect of the war spreading. Well, I guess I share your concern about the escalation of the conflict, because initially we were told even sending tanks would be too much of a dangerous escalation. Yet, this is a long time ago. We crossed this line, long distance weapons, many other red lines we weren't supposed to cross. Now we're sending depleted uranium ammunition, cluster ammunition, possibly F-16. So it feels like we'll keep looking for these silver bullets, something, a game changer, something that can turn the tide. But if you're correct now, and Ukraine is moving towards collapse, there must be immense pressure on how NATO can keep the war going or prevent defeat. But at the moment, it doesn't seem there's anything else besides a direct intervention. So of course, Western Ukraine is a possibility, but I also heard a lot of chatter lately about the Black Sea, providing these convoys for Ukrainian grain, which would be a way for NATO to get involved directly into this war. I just do you see I'm thinking more the Black Sea option now. Do you think this is something that will be pursued?
Well, keep in mind that President Biden just signed an executive order that directed that U.S. soldiers on the ground in Ukraine be paid hazard pay, in other words, combat pay. Well, he's been telling us that there are no U.S. soldiers on the ground in Western Ukraine. Well, we know that's not true, just as we know there are many soldiers from many NATO nations on the ground in Western Ukraine. It's a very dangerous thing, though, to signal this publicly and make this public statement, because it conveys the impression to Moscow that we're actually contemplating intervention there. My concern with the Polish and Lithuanian connection is that if they go in there, they will be attacked. Putin has made that very clear. He said, well, yes, if they come into Western Ukraine, they will never leave. We will make sure they never leave. In other words, they'll be buried there. Well, I think the Poles and Ukrainians mistakenly believe that if that happens, that we will then send our forces in to help them. Now, maybe someone in Washington is prepared to do that I don't know. I know that the senior military leadership in Washington is very fearful of that. But it may be that the political leaders in Washington don't think that's the risky alternative to watching Ukraine collapse. They may say, well, if we don't go in some fashion to help the Poles, our credibility will be completely gone. NATO will collapse. And that takes us back to your opening question. What about NATO over the long run? And I think NATO's doomed, because NATO consists of 32 nations now? Every nation has a different set of interests. Not all of those nations see the world through the same lens as people in Washington and Brussels. and in Berlin or Oslo. In other words, the world looks very different depending upon where you stand. And trying to drag NATO into this could absolutely end it quickly. And I don't think Washington believes that. I think, again, they look at the sheepish behavior of the ruling elites in Europe and say, well, these people have no choice, but they have to go along with this anyway. Well, perhaps that's true for the globalists that are running your countries, but that's not necessarily true for the people that live in Europe. And I think the European electorates see things differently. In other words, I don't have crystal clear picture of what is going to happen. What I do know is that officers who've sat in on meetings and tried to explain the true situation and point to the dramatic increase in Russian military power and the excellent performance of Russian forces are not welcome as discussants in these meetings. If you want to be on the inside, if you want to be with the four stars and the politicians, you have to talk about, oh, these Ukrainians are going to win. These Russians are just stupid. They can't do anything right. And if they come up against NATO forces, they're doomed. Well, that's a lot of nonsense to make those kinds of statements, but that's more popular than I think is healthy for our governments right now.
But you mentioned before that the Russians haven't had their major offensive yet. And I was curious why we haven't seen it, because, well, I do understand it's a war of attrition and it shouldn't merely be measured in territory, but also loss of troops. But on the other hand, we see that the Russians have mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They're armed to the teeth. And on the other side, we see that they have degraded the Ukrainian military to a great extent, even emptied NATO's weapon storages, by which we are now admitting as well. So as a military man and a scholar in this, why do you think Russia hasn't gone for these big arrows yet?
I think that President Putin remains cautious because he does not want to precipitate a direct confrontation with NATO and the United States. That's always been his top concern. But I think he's got plenty of senior officers who are telling him, look, if we continue to wait this way, people will misinterpret our restraint for weakness, and they will think that they can exploit this weakness. And I think the senior officers in the senior ranks of the Russian military who are saying that are correct. You cannot win any war by sitting on the defensive. It can't be done. You can kill almost everybody in front of you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can win. And I think increasingly the view in the senior ranks of the Russian side is that until we're moving down the main streets of Kiev and our forces have crossed the Dnieper River, no one is going to believe the war is really over. In other words, they won't believe that we've won it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So the danger right now is too much Russian restraint. And if it continues, I think it will invite Polish and Lithuanian intervention. And then that is Pandora's box. God help all of us. The consequences of that are profound.
I heard this argument from people such as Michael McFaul, suggesting that if America only steps up and enters, then the Russians would be too fearful and bow down. And this is also something I heard from Moscow, which is that they have two risks. One, yes, if they hit back, they risk war with NATO. On the other hand, the risk of not hitting back is becoming much greater, because as they see, the emboldens the adversary to think in the ways that McFaul is thinking, that if they only roll across the border, then they would run away. So for them, it seems to be a bit of a dilemma, avoiding big war, but on the other hand, don't have this restraint misunderstood as a weakness.
Remember, the Russians have also, and I think Putin deserves a lot of credit for this, have also been very sensitive to the opinions of people in the global South, not just China and India, but also the global South. And he has not wanted them to think that he was someone who would dismiss the humanitarian dimensions of the war, and he hasn't. In other words, he's tried to make